Undertale. The indie game where nobody has to die, it challenges your desire for video game bloodlust, and it makes you regret ever going to Tumblr.
Oh my god!
It touches your heart in a way that many AAA titles don't. So today, we're giving that back by making our own Undertale fan art out of the socks off our own feet. It's not, they don't really come off my feet. So on today's Let's Stitch, my character of choice was Papyrus. He's a fan favorite of the Undertale series, and I've never really made a doll like this before. I used a bit more of a traditional doll making technique, and I'm going to be completely honest, I had no idea what I was doing for the majority of this project. But I'm going to break down precisely how I did it, how I went about it, and the materials that we need. Here we go. We're going to need a white sock, a couple of white socks actually. I used about 3. Black sock, I didn't even use a whole one, so a scrap of black sock is fine. We've got red sock, blue sock, yellow sock, then you want your black, white, red, yellow, blue thread. The cape here isn't really a sock, it's just a scrap of red sort of velveteen fabric. You can use whatever scrap fabric you want, but probably not a sock would be my recommendation, just a piece of scrap. You want 2 white buttons. Some pins would be a good idea, a black felt tip marker, and I would also suggest I used a chopstick, like a dowel or a pen, just something that's really thin so you can work with these tiny little appendages. Let's go! I'm going to start with what I thought was probably the hardest part, which was the head. The head has a lot of components to it, and it was a lot of trial and error for me to get that right. So let's get started on that. I started off by cutting the toe of one of the white socks off, then I stitched that into a ball, stuffed that up nice and tight. It doesn't have to be pretty because no one's actually going to see this. This is going on the inside of the skull. It's like skullception. Then I took some black sock and cut 2 tiny little squares, rectangles out of that, and folded those up, stitched them along the sides into these sort of pockets. These pockets create some more depth to the eyes as opposed to just stitching some black circles on, so I thought that was really important. I took a marker and I marked that little white ball so I knew where the eyes were going. Then I ladder stitched that all the way around to make that secure. I used some pins on there just to keep them in place so they weren't shifting around while I was trying to stitch those on. Then I took some more white sock and out of the heel cut this sort of oblong piece. I stitched that almost the whole way around. Obviously we want to leave a gap on the side so we can flip that back inside out and stick this little piece inside of that. This is the actual skull, or the skin. So I took a marker and made a little sort of inverted Y to mark where I'm going to cut the eye holes in. An integral part of Papyrus's look is that cocked eye thing that he has, so it's important that you get 1 small hole and 1 big hole. Once you insert that inner skull to the outer skull, just line up the eye holes and ladder stitch that all the way around. Here's where that chopstick really comes in handy so that you can make sure the sockets stay open. Pat it with a little bit of stuffing to give that some more depth, and then stitch up the side. For a bit more of a skull shape, I just ladder stitched along the back and cinched that together. Then I assembled the jaw, which probably took more attempts than just the top of the skull. The trick is to not make the jaw bones too thin, because it's going to be really hard to get those stuffed and without frays. Now before I stitch those 2 pieces together, it's time to do a little bit of embroidery. I love embroidery! That's so fun! To simulate the mouth and the nose, I just used a back stitch. If you're using a thin thread, then you'll want to loop that over 2 or 3 times just to make sure that it stands out. Also, just make sure your teeth are evenly spaced. I know Papyrus doesn't have the best dental work in the Undertale series, but if you've got like 7 teeth up top and then 4 teeth on the bottom, it's just going to look sloppy as a product. Once I had the teeth on both the top and bottom jaw, I ladder stitched those two pieces together. Then I passed the thread back and forth on each side of the jaw just to keep it secure. With the head out of the way, I took another white sock and I cut a large circle out of the toe. Then I flipped that inside out and stitched it so that the seam doesn't show. Flipped it right side out, and then I stuffed that. I left a little hole at the bottom since that's where I'm going to attach his spine anyway. Putting that aside, I took the black sock and I cut 5 long rectangles out of that. While 4 of these pieces are going to be equal lengths, the 5th one is going to be about half the size of the others. That's going to be my spine. The chopstick again is really helping me out here to flip these pieces right side out after I've sewn them. The real trick to the arms and the legs just lies in the fact that I was dedicated to making a separation of the bones here between the radius and the ulna and the fibula and tibia because I hate myself. I cut a slit about through the middle of the sock and then I ladder stitched that together. Now of course that makes it really hard to stuff once you're done with that. But hey, you know, you live and you learn. Sometimes you wish that you weren't so dedicated to all the tiny minutia of every single project and you didn't drive yourself insane. But that's the body you're stuck in, it's the life you live, and you just gotta play your cards. Speaking of minutia, it's time to add a little tiny pelvis to that tiny little spine. You know, the pelvis that no one's really gonna see because you're putting underwear over the top, but you're gonna know that it's there, and that's all that really matters. Another thing I found was really important was to make sure that the joints were movable. So stitch a line across the elbow and the knee. Kind of like Woody in Toy Story. I think that's a really smart design choice. Take some more white sock and cut 2 tiny versions of that round chest plate that we just did. Now it's time to take some red sock for the feet and the arms. We're starting with the feet first, which are essentially just 2 red ovals folded over and then stitched around. Once they've been stuffed, just stitch them onto the legs. And to make the boot, I just took the ankle off of the red sock, folded that over, and then ladder stitched that around, stitched it to the foot. It's all pretty standard fare at this point. With the gloves, it's the same deal. Just cut a mitten-like shape, fold the edge over, sort of stitch that up, and attach that to your wrist. Now comes those undies. Here's where we're getting into some really small pieces, and smaller pieces of material means you have to be extra diligent so that you're keeping all of your edges concealed so that the piece looks clean. So for now, just take your underwear pieces, stitch them while they're inside out, just along the sides. You don't have to worry about the leg holes yet. Then flip the piece right side out, tuck the top edge inside, and stitch that really tight so that it doesn't come loose. Next, we need some of that yellow for trim. So take the yellow sock and I just cut a long singular strip and made my pieces out of that. Chop, chop. While this isn't a technically difficult part of the doll, you do want to be careful that you're keeping all of your edges concealed. I use a ladder stitch almost the entire way through. That keeps the edges concealed and clean. Especially for the belt part, which is a super thin piece, you want to make sure that, you know, you don't want him looking a slob. Then I closed each leg up and I stitched a joint near the top because once I attach the legs to the pelvis, that part's not going to move. So you want a nice joint there so he can kick along and jump and run and catch those humans, whatever those look like. Since the top of his spinal column is exposed beneath the skull, I wanted to create some rings around so that way you have individual segments. I just took a black thread, ran that through and looped it, cinched it up kind of tight till you create a small pinch. And I did 3 for good measure. Then I simply ladder stitched all of that together. Now, the arms are a little bit different from what I did with the legs because these pauldrons here get in the way of that jointed action. So I've got a different joint that we're gonna do here, which is called a button joint. For a button joint, you'll anchor on one side where your button is, and you'll push the thread all the way through to the other side. You'll anchor to another button. With a joint like this, you get a really nice 360-degree rotation. For the symbols on his chest piece, I used the back stitch to embroider it just like I did with the head. Just make sure that's really tight. And finally, it's time to move on to the last part of our papyrus, which is the cape. Scarf? Cape? I'm not really sure. I folded it like a scarf. I took the one end and started at the corner, wrapped that around, and I just kind of molded it until it looked right, even directly down to that tiny little hook tear that he has at the front. I don't know. The cape doesn't need a lot to hold it in place, just a few small stitches to tack it to the body is all it needs. So that's it for our friend Papyrus. He really was quite a lot, but I had a lot of fun with it. So I say give it a shot. Let me know how you did it. Let me know what you think about the project. It's not all that technical a project, but it is time consuming. So you'll want to dedicate a whole day. With that said, keep making stuff and I'll see you next time. Humans away!